Ed and Peter Schein, you are so welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. Now, you will have heard a brief introduction from me, but in your own words, would you like, first of all, Ed, to introduce yourself a little bit about your history, your background, and where you are today? And then, Peter, you can follow on with the kind of the more recent collaboration.
Sure. Very happy to be here and very happy to tell you a little about myself. I grew up in an academic family. My father was a professor of physics. It took me 3 full college years before I figured out that I couldn't do physics and had to find something else. And somehow psychology appealed. So I became a social psychologist, very serious, spent a year at Stanford and then got a PhD at Harvard. And that was significant because Harvard had at that time brought together psychology, sociology, and anthropology. So my launching into this academic career was very broad,
Mm.
broad social science base. But then, of course, I got seduced. Instead of going into a department and being a proper professor, a man by the name of Douglas McGregor, whose name many of you will know because of his famous theory X, theory Y.
Mm.
Do people really want to work or don't they? He was at MIT when I was finishing my PhD and said, instead of wasting your time teaching psychology to undergraduate psych students, why don't you come to the Sloan School, this newly created advanced MBA and PhD program, and see if you can apply social psychology to managers. Well, I said, well, that sounds tempting because I loved Cambridge and wanted to stay there. And so I asked him, so what should I teach? And he smiled. He said, I'm not going to tell you. We're hiring you to figure out what managers need from social psychology. So
No
I
pressure.
started from scratch, and that was very good for me because I found out right away that teaching in an applied setting and teaching managers, particularly the MBAs, that was a lost cause because they came to business school to learn finance and economics and marketing. And so they uh, actually were polite, but they didn't learn anything.
Mm.
When I got involved with middle level executives and when I learned to do some in consulting, then I realized how suddenly the middle level executives, they wanted everything I knew because they said, why didn't you guys teach us that when we were MBAs? And I said, we did. You just didn't realize that your problems were going to be people problems.
Mm.
So then I, over the many years, wandered through career research, learned how to consult, wrote a very important little book called Process Consultation, because I soon learned that how we consult, it has very little in common with the traditional formal consulting firms. And so I became more of a scholar practitioner, developing uh, my own skills in how to work with organizations. And then when I retired from MIT, figured out, well, now what next? And I had, after my wife died in 2008, I had to go get near one of my kids, and Peter was the logical choice. So I came out to be with him, not realizing that that would start a fourth career, namely this organizational culture and learning institute, where we would figure out how to put our two sets of interests together and see what that would produce in the way of joint writing. And I'll just close with saying that has been a marvelous positive experience. We've now co-authored 4 books, and I'm just delighted with where it has all gone.
Brilliant.
Yeah, that's great. And what you just saw Ed do there was create a new book title, because the book is the Organizational Culture and Leadership textbook, and the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute is Ed's and my partnership. But Ed called it Organizational Culture and Learning, which is that. Okay, so that's we now know the future. We just have to get there.
The new book title, I love it.
So yeah. Well, so I just the quick bit of background on me that's interesting in a way is that I sort of went through my own similar conversion experience, where I went to Stanford thinking that I was going to do psychology as well as an undergrad. And this is a few years after the infamous Stanford prison experiment. So of course the psychology department was very prominent, a little controversial, but at any rate, I kind of had the same sort of epiphany that maybe that Ed did, that just psychology isn't really enough. So the broadest, what's sort of often referred to as sort of the mother of the social scientists, or social sciences, is anthropology. It's sort of the most comprehensive. So I found social anthropology as the way to kind of spread my degrees of freedom a little bit. Loved it, but ended up going to business school and having a 30-year career in Silicon Valley. And but at the same time realizing that for all the interest in technology and sort of some of the technical aspects of work in Silicon Valley, I found myself, my heart was sort of drawing me to these, human issues in big organizations. I was doing mergers and acquisitions, and sure, you could make the financial and technical fit work, but the bigger issue was always, would the people fit happen? And it's all about integration. I mean, at least for Sun Microsystems where I work, some companies will do it just as a financial accretion kind of exercise, but we were a people-oriented, technically oriented company that really wanted to make sure that we were going to bring engineers on, they would work with the existing engineers and so on. And so, but I really found that being the center of gravity for me. So it was very easy then, a few years after that career in Silicon Valley, to sort of to have some ideas that I wanted to work on with Ed. We started to talk about books that we could write, and really the first major effort in that regard was our book Humble Leadership. But since the forming of the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute, we've done 4 book projects together and a number of consulting projects. And so here we are talking about the second edition of Humble Enquiry, but really there's a through line with all of the books. So I suspect that we'll talk about the body of work as much as just that one book.
Yeah, no, that sounds really great. I was going to say, I mean, there's so much that I could pick up on there. And I, in particular, and longtime listeners of the podcast would know this idea of, would the people fit happen? Like, just that simple question, I think would be great. And maybe we come back to it. And for listeners as well, I just warn in advance, I may switch between saying Humble Enquiry, which I think is the pronunciation that you would use in the US, versus Humble Enquiry, which is what I would say being in Ireland. But we're here to talk about the second edition of that book. So do you want to talk to me, whoever wants to go first, like what is the book about?
I'll go first because I think the history of the book is itself interesting. When I came out here in 2011, I was working on autobiography, and my academic interest was really to pull together everything I knew about helping. Because the difference between just being a scholar or being a scholar practitioner is the scholar just wants to describe stuff. The scholar practitioner wants to apply it. And so I read a book called Helping, which I think is actually a very good book. It hasn't caught on quite that way, but in the last chapter of that book, I describe different ways one builds the helping relationship. And one of the chapter titles there is Humble Enquiry. And it was the publisher who said, someday you've got to write a book by that title, because that's a dynamite title. And I said, go away, I've just written the book. I don't want to have anything to do with that.
Yeah.
But remind me from time to time.
Mm.
And then what happened, the publisher did remind me, and I kept saying no, until one day I was looking at some interesting mushrooms that were growing outside this big apartment facility where I live. And a little old lady with her dog marched up to me and with her long pointed finger said, "Those are poisonous, you know." And so I'm looking up at her saying, what's going on? What do you? And I said, yes, I know. And she pointed her finger at me again and said, they can kill you, you know. Well, that turns out to be wrong because I knew about mushrooms. And at that point, I found myself very offended. Who was this person to march up to me and tell me about something that I knew a lot about? I knew about mushrooms. And that triggered the book. I said, all right, now I'm ready to write that book, because I'm sick and tired. At dinner, all the time, people were always telling each other stuff.
Mm.
So the real motive was to attack the culture of tell and create a foundation for a culture of building relationships through inquiry. And that's really how the book got started. And Peter can talk a little bit about how the second edition evolved. But I thought it was important that this didn't just come out of my head. This was partly the interaction with this culture that's very much the US culture. We're always telling each other stuff and thinking that that's the way to be.
Yeah, and so just to comment, as Ed mentioned on the second edition, one of the things that really sort of was a little internal motivation was that I think the US and arguably the world has gone through this period over the last, 5-10 years of, for lack of a better term, trying to reconcile different fact universes. Early in the Trump presidency, there was a reference made by one of the press people to, well, alternative. We're talking about alternative facts, and this idea that you have a set of beliefs and facts over here, and a set of beliefs and alternative facts over here, and the truth ends up being both or neither. And so part of the whole motivation around Humble Enquiry is, at work, we really have to get to what's a collective sense of what's going on, and to tell what we know and shape perception just by telling people what we know, rather than drawing people out and sort of creating a collective sense of what's going on, is a good way to make bad decisions. Frame it around what you believe and what you know, and let somebody else silently frame what they believe and what they know around their alternative facts. And then you end up with conflicts and poor decisions.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to get at is, in order to, get to that deeper sense of what's going on, you have to build open and trusting relationships with the people that you work with.
Yeah.
And you have to get them to tell you what's on their mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're the leader, you benefit by knowing what's on their mind.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
you have to invest the time and the energy and the attitude at work to draw out what people know. You're still the leader. You're still going to be responsible for making the decisions, but you can make the decisions in a more informed, collective, consensus-based way. Those are going to, down the road, your work as a body of the decisions you've made, well, you're going to end up with a better body because you're going to end up with better decisions.
Yeah, brilliant. Love that approach. Something I made note of then is it kind of like this idea of being helpful versus being right. So many people are so hung up on being right and having all the answers that they actually neglect to be helpful to other people.
Well,
I think that's
comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me comment on that around the word humble. How did humble get into the title? Because it's actually both as a consultant and later as a writer and helping, I realized that the most important thing is to, in the context of talking to someone else, to be here and now humble. Here and now humble. I don't think I'm a particularly humble person normally, but if I'm with a client or if I'm trying to build a relationship, at that point in the relationship, I have to recognize that I don't know everything, that I'm curious about the other person, that I have to help them formulate the problem in ways that make sense, that together we have to figure out what is reality, because as Peter said, neither one of us starts out knowing it. So very important point is not to confuse the word humble with the trait of humility.
Okay.
Has nothing to do. In our leadership book, we have all kinds of very arrogant people who are humble leaders because they know that when it comes to decision making and working with others, at that point you have to become skillful in listening and really paying attention. And that is the here and now humility that we emphasize.
It's a really great distinction. Thank you. Thanks for making that.
And I'd just like to add to your idea of being right versus helping. The other thing that we introduced was a reference to a futurist friend of ours, Bob Johansson at the Institute for the Future, who talks about leaders in the future needing to know the difference and make the right choices around certainty versus clarity. So if you become certain of something, you've convinced yourself, and I've heard it referred to as the conceit of certainty, versus trying to gain enough clarity of what's really going on, because the world is so complicated and it's not getting any simpler, that what you really need is clarity, and what's going to get in your way is certainty. I mean, you might be lucky, you're right, you might be certain of something, and maybe 10% of the time you're right.
Yeah.
But if you're opting for, your biggest goal is clarity, which means assimilating more information and having a vision for where you want to go, but the clarity allows you to see more, have a sort of a deeper depth of field on that vision. Clarity is ultimately a more important goal than certainty. And that's sort of, again, that's kind of, it is a little bit of an indictment of the sort of, call it the 1980s model of sort of the bold entrepreneur or the bold financier who is driven and, brave and arrogant and individualistic.
Yeah.
Who pursues something, until, pursues something until until they get there. And they might fail all along the way, but they're so driven, and that is one model. And there were lots of success stories of that sort of heroic leader. But I think the idea around clarity is that, you're going to navigate a very, sort of lots of twists and bends along the way, but maintaining that clarity, and maintaining what Ed described as that here and now humility in order to assimilate more information rather than just ignoring stuff and pursuing your path.
Yeah.
I think that's the distinction that we really like to try to make.
Yeah, I really like that.
And we trigger each other, so I have something more to say.
Yeah, brilliant. I love it.
So the other point about humble inquiry is that people get confused by not understanding that the definition really is asking questions to which you do not know the answer.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of ways of asking questions. There are rhetorical questions, there are questions of diagnosis, of why this. And so we make quite a point initially of saying humble inquiry is a particular skill, because you first of all have to figure out what it is I don't know, and not just leap in with a whole bunch of questions where I think I already have the answer, and access my curiosity and access my ignorance, which turns out to be, as we're now working with a couple of organizations, we think we all know how to do that because we do that in our friendship relationships or when we're truly trying to build a new relationship. But when we go to the workplace, we often sort of run dry on how do I do that at work, where I'm always used to asking the rhetorical question, where I already think I know the answer.
Yeah.
And you're asking me to do something different? Yes, something very different. And in some cases, we've gotten involved then in actually training people how to learn how to be ignorant and ask questions from what they don't know.
Yeah. Rather than, well, I know the answer to this, or you assume that you know the answer to something, and therefore you think you know what the answer should be. It's almost like a coaching approach where you're going in with genuine curiosity and genuine ignorance as to what the reality is for the person that you're asking.
Unless you're talking about executive coaching, which, if you want to get me started on that, that's executive coaching.
That can be another
where
podcast
you do
episode.
know the answer and you're trying to indoctrinate the person into fitting in.
You're trying to get the right answer from them, let's say.
And teaching them how to fit in. So I have a real problem with the word coaching if, as so many people implicitly are talking about executive coaching rather than coaching a client who's paying for his or her own development.
I see. Yeah. I'm let's say I'm referring to the latter kind as opposed to the former kind. But brilliant. I mean, there's so much to dive into. There's so many questions I have around this, and I suppose the first one that springs to mind is: does it rely on the senior leaders to develop this type of attitude, let's say, in an organization? So does it have to come from the top?
I think so, absolutely, because it has to be not only role modeled, but if the CEO develops that relationship with her direct reports, let's say, it has to then be supplemented by that same CEO saying, and now I'm going to start measuring each of you on the degree to which you do that with your direct reports. So it both role modeling and creating the incentives for the next layer to do it, so that that next layer will in turn role model and create the incentives.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that question was because I always had the assumption that it would have to come from the top. But in a recent conversation that I had, someone was explaining that it didn't necessarily. And what I'm referring to specifically is psychological safety. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that and what that means for this this process or this attitude or having this sense of curiosity. And in the conversation that I had about psychological safety, I always was of the opinion that creating a culture of psychological safety had to come from the top. But in this conversation, I was challenged about that and said, well, actually, as an individual, you can take responsibility for how you show up in the organization and how you approach your own psychological safety. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on the role that psychological safety plays in this.
I mean, I guess I'll take a first stab at that, and it sort of touches on that idea of how culture works and how culture exists in an organization. And the key there is really how an organization learns collectively and then sort of institutionalizes that learning. And that's one of the dimensions that we often will refer to as culture. It's things that have become successful because they were challenged in some way and learned how to react to that external challenge and then sort of organize internally to adapt to that external challenge. And so that idea of learning as a group is so important. And so if you have a part of the organization that becomes particularly successful because they learned how to adapt, or they learned how to produce a product in a better way that was better fit to their market, or more profitable or something. And then you learn that the way they did that is that they had a much better sort of substrate of psychological safety that allowed them to be more effective. They may have been just as efficient, but in fact, they were more effective because they were doing a better job of keeping everybody real and keeping everybody involved and letting people, share what they knew. And what's interesting to us about that is I've described something sort of generically, but that's also one way of describing what Google learned when they did their Project Aristotle, that they looked for successful engineering teams across the organization. And no surprise, Google's very good at studying itself. They're very good at studying a lot of things, but they're very good at studying itself. And, they thought they were going to find that they were using tools in a different way, or they were, had some creative way of organizing their workflows or whatever. But the one thing that they found in that Project Aristotle, which has been written up many times, was that there was that common substrate of psychological safety in the sort of more successful teams, relatively more successful teams than others. And so we're describing something generically how I started, but this has been true in practice. And but I guess the point being, there's no reason why it can't be sort of middle out, right? Okay. It doesn't have to be top down. Because if you're the CEO of an organization that sees one group that's way outperforming others, and you discover that the way that group learned to be more successful was because of this establishing this substrate of psychological safety, then that's going to send a message, right, to senior leadership to adapt in that direction, to try to move other teams in that direction, to try to maybe even move your relationship with your board in that direction. I think it's both.
Love that.
culture historically tends to be a top-down thing.
Yeah.
But cultural evolution happens in all directions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Anything to add to that, Ed?
Yes, I would add that we do kind of say to people, take a chance, speak up. And I think we address that in the book by saying that's all well and good, but we have lots and lots of evidence, particularly in the safety field, where people do speak up and the accident happens anyway.
Okay.
And so the question is, how can that be that we have whistleblowers, we have all kinds of people who express extraordinary courage, and yet our reward systems punish whistleblowers. They generally are treated very badly. And what I observed myself in a utility where electrical workers would see problems down in the mechanics, and they would tell their boss, and the boss would say, "Thank you very much, I'll triage it." And the boss would imply, I got enough on my plate. Don't bother me with your extra stuff.
Yeah.
And so the courage is one thing to speak up, but what really determines it, and why I think both Peter and I think it has to start at the top, is the actual reward system that operates. And in lots of organizations, there are courageous people, but the reward system is productivity, time, schedule. Those take the priority over your interesting new idea or that point you're trying to make about this isn't safe.
Yeah. 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 Really interesting. You know what? The organization shows what it values by what kind of behavior it rewards.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
And in terms of moving towards, and I'm trying to think of how to describe it. Is it describing it as like a culture of humble inquiry, or like how would you describe it, and what are the steps needed in order to make the transformation?
I think we should, if it's all right, if I go back and talk about the other kind of important dimension of all this, which is relationships.
Course. Yeah.
Because one thing that we were starting to get at a few minutes ago is, I started thinking about the contrast that we made. Ed first started making this contrast in the Humble Consulting book. And basically we've tried to get this thread into every book that we've written since, which is to be very intentional about the kinds of relationships that you try to establish at work. And the critical contrast is between what we describe as level 1 relationships, which are inherently transactional. You have a relationship, you have expectations of each other, but you're staying in your role. You're maintaining professional distance, you're accepting and handing off, and you're participating in a well-defined machine-like workflow.
Yeah.
And it's defined around those roles and those job descriptions, and that works in certain kinds of industries. And our argument in Humble Leadership and in Humble Enquiry, the second edition, is that the world's too complicated for that. That we're past that.
Yeah.
We're
not machines.
Yeah, we're not assembly lines.
Yeah.
We're not financial transactional engines. We are most of the world of work is much more complicated than that. We use the VUCA term, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I think that's generally how people experience their work, and the pandemic has sort of amplified that.
Mm.
So, while level one transactional relationships at work and a culture built around that might have worked just fine 50 years ago, we are making the argument that we need to develop level two relationships, which are whole person to whole person relationships,
Yeah.
where you do go out of your way through a process of humbly inquiring and honestly humbly sharing, because it's a two-way relationship, and sharing and inquiry go together in building that, again, what we refer to as a level two relationship. We sort of grudgingly decided to adopt this term personizing, because it's different than personalizing.
Yeah.
Right? Personalizing is like you have personalized HR stack for every individual. That's one thing. That's great. But personizing is this idea that you are trying to develop a whole relationship with a whole person,
Mm.
because you need to tell each other what's really going on. It
Yeah.
can't just be about the transaction between boss and subordinate or between peer and peer. It has to be more than that, because the world's too complicated to just keep to those, professionally distant, I'm going to only tell you what you need,
Yeah.
because that's how our relationship has been defined and that's how it conforms with our job descriptions. That's not enough anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think what we're getting at with the idea of humble inquiry as a way of building those level two open, trusting relationships is that that has an important influence on the culture in the organization.
Mm.
But people have to be willing to do it. And our argument would be that if your goal is to be adaptive and innovative, well, don't try to build that spirit in an organization by just staying in your lanes, sticking to your roles, adhering to your job descriptions.
Yeah.
Because you need to do more to out innovate very, innovative competitors.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So this is where we sort of see all of these through lines between humble inquiry that leads to the idea of level two relationships, adaptive, resilient relationships, and evolving what we would describe as the social culture within an organization, or within a work group or a division or an organization at whole.
Mm.
So that's a lot, but that's the way that we would try to sort of paint the picture of how these puzzle pieces are all put together.
Yeah. 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 No, I think the relationships at work are really, really important. And you're so right in what you say, that like it's gone beyond just transactional. I think people would agree that you spend so much time at work that you don't just want to have that transactional relationship with the other people that you work with as well. You want to have that more personal relationship with other people and to understand what's going on for them as well, and being able
Right.
to share your full self at work.
Right. This is about being happier at work, right? Well, it would be
Exactly.
our proposition that if you do have those person-to-person connections, you might be working on a really tough project that's really bogging you down, but those personal connections are what make you happier at work, even if the work is
Definitely.
really tough.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. And I suppose before we get on to the steps, maybe like with the organizations that you've worked with, what are the reasons that people aren't doing this already? What are some of the blocks that exist from moving towards this type of relationship building?
Well, the major block that I see is uh, the fact that the occupational culture of management, how
Okay.
managers learn to manage, is a culture of tell and give orders.
Yeah.
And I don't think the business schools or the books have abandoned that model.
Okay,
You
interesting.
don't find in the model of management things like inquire, build relationships, mentor. Those are all extras. Get the job done is the primary one.
Yeah.
And just to add to what Peter said, the two things that are missing, to be very precise, in a complex world, the boss issues a complex order. In a level one relationship, the subordinate doesn't quite get it, but knows that the boss is busy. So the subordinate says to herself, well, I'll do my best. And I hope to God I do it right, but makes mistakes, bad decisions. That's problem one. Problem two, the boss says, here's what we should do. And the subordinate knows that there is a better way. But there is no incentive in that professional distance for the subordinate to speak up.
Yeah.
Well, if the boss wants to do it that way, fine. She's the boss. So it's about feeling better. It's about happier employees. But I hate to lose that it's ultimately pragmatically necessary.
Yeah.
It's not about happier, it's about necessary. And the happier comes about as a consequence of being treated as a full adult, of the professional distance being collapsed.
Yeah.
So that's an important reminder. It's not about being nicer, which a lot of people read the book and say, oh, I got to be nicer to my people. Wrong.
Yeah.
That's not going to get you there.
Love that.
Well, and one of the key points there is that humans have really good, fake radars, right? We know when something's not genuine. That's why, vulnerability and authenticity get talked about so much around organizations, because people really understand that. People read people very well. And so if somebody's being inauthentic and concealing vulnerability, people see it right away. It's obvious. And then, then we have, Dilbert cartoons, right? About, all of these sort of like horribly common dysfunctions at work because of, people being inauthentic with each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And concealing information from each other.
Yeah.
Well, it raises an important point too, to what Ed was saying, that we've found that one of the places that really takes a great interest in the Humble Enquiry idea is in healthcare.
Okay.
And there are any number of reasons, but at some level, it's because healthcare is generally typically dealing with life and death.
Yes, of course.
And so concealing information or even sharing information or failing to share information because you didn't feel psychologically safe. You weren't willfully concealing information, but you weren't handed the mic to say what you saw and what was going on. I think healthcare institutions who are measured on quality and are always striving to improve really get the importance of that. And there's no reason why the same shouldn't be true in a software enterprise, except that generally in a software enterprises, we're not dealing with life and death.
It's not life and death.
But you are dealing with quality. And
it becomes critically important, I suppose, when you're talking life and death versus, like you're saying, in a software organization, then it's not a life or death situation, but still, it's still really, really important.
Yeah, but there's still something to be gained.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to come back to this idea briefly on professional distance, because that has certainly come up in a situation that I've been dealing with a client recently, and this idea of professional distance and maybe managers not understanding that concept, by which I mean that they don't understand the power that they exert by asking someone to do something. They assume that people will question or that they will push back in some way. But if they haven't created that psychologically safe environment, then it's not likely that their employee perceives this is coming from the CEO or this is coming from my boss. So it must be really, really important, and I should do it. I should get on with it. And as you mentioned, Ed, you know, they might think, oh, my boss is so busy and I can't ask them for help, or I can't ask questions to get a better understanding of what it is I'm supposed to do. So I just wanted to kind of raise that point. And then the idea of vulnerability and authenticity, that is certainly something that's come up multiple times on the podcast, especially recently. And I think it is critically important for this. Any thoughts around either of those concepts and how to manage that, or how to create a better environment where people can be vulnerable, they can be a bit more authentic and ask the questions that they need to ask?
I just want to share one quick point about vulnerability, and it's simply that you are vulnerable every day you go to work, because again, that it's because of that VUCA idea. Everything changes day to day.
Yeah.
And so to somehow believe that you're not vulnerable to the market changing, or some new bit of information that changes your course of work that day, you are vulnerable. It's just a question of can you accept it, and can you then allow other people to see that you've accepted this intrinsic vulnerability. And I would argue that that becomes more acute the higher up in the organization you go.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, definitely.
There is an addendum that I think is important to that point, and that is not only the culture of management, but even deeper, the culture of work. We think of work as getting things done, decisions and accomplishments and outputs. We do not define work as communication and relationships. And yet, you can't really get anything done without conversation and without relationships. And just to leap to a completely different point, companies that really have mastered this point, the managers will tell you that they spend as much as 60 to 70% of their time on HR mentoring issues. 60 to 70% of their time on building relationships, communicating, mentoring, and whatever.
More about the H than the R.
What?
More about the H than the R, in other words.
Yeah. And so many companies talk about best practice, but I don't think they've ever paid attention to that point as a best practice point.
Yeah.
I think most managers don't have a clue about how much time they should be spending building relationships, getting to know their people, communicating clearly. Now, the hooker in that is those are often feminine values. And will we do better ultimately if more women get into management roles?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that could be an entirely different podcast, and something I'm so passionate about is helping and supporting women to get to those leadership positions. I think it is really critical. And interestingly, Ed, I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone describe it in the way that you've described it, that 60 or 70% of the time needs to be spent on building relationships and that human aspect of work. You know, it is very much focused on getting things done. And even in recent conversations I've had with clients as well, it's if someone has to manage 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, you kind of think about, well, what does that mean in terms of the meetings that I need to have, or any issues that might arise that kind of complicates things. And you sort of see the time spent on dealing with people expanding, but from a very from a negative perspective, let's say, whereas if we focus on building those relationships up front and what it means to get to know your employees on a human level, then hopefully later on a lot of those issues that potentially could arise are done away with, because you've invested the time in getting to know people, in using humble inquiry, going in with a curious mind, going in with an ignorant view of, you tell me about you, because I'm coming with no assumptions, and building that psychological safety, building that trust within the team.
Can I give you an example that has struck me recently? In many, many organizations, the problems are siloism, and the groups aren't talking to each other.
Yeah.
The answer to that is very simple. The CEO has to bring the heads of the silos into the room at one time and build a team.
Yeah.
And that doesn't even occur to most CEOs, that instead of having the heads of the silos compete with each other for resources, that building a team out of the top of the organization is the answer.
Yeah.
And why don't they think of it? Because our management training never talks about how to build teams and the value of building teams at the top of the organization.
Yeah. And one of the recent podcasts with Dan Norenberg, he spoke about exactly that. It's about building effective teams at that leadership level, because oftentimes leadership, when we talk about it, is very individual focused, and you put maybe one person at a time through a leadership program, or even if you put multiple people through a leadership program, it's very much focused on their individual leadership and their style
Right.
of leadership and all of that kind of stuff. What Dan focuses on is identifying that, but not only that, and I'm not going to dwell too much on a past podcast, but he talks about the CEO often kind of almost washes his hands of it, saying, my leadership team needs to change, I don't need to change, but actually it's the entire leadership team that needs to be involved in that change.
Right. Yeah, to Ed's point about siloism, one of the sort of simplest ways to deal with that I don't know how comfortable any company in the US would be doing this. Some companies have, but it's generally because we've become so technical in what we do and so expert in our particular, sort of fields of work, that it makes it hard at senior management level to just say, okay, everybody's rotating. You're taking over that division, and you're now taking this over this engineering group. Everybody rotate, because all of a sudden you're walking each other's shoes.
Yeah.
And the insights and you start being very vulnerable. You realize you are going to rely on humble inquiry. If all of a sudden you're inheriting your charge is now a different set of people and a completely different set of products and technologies.
Yeah.
It's a very hard thing to do, and the problem is we measure everything by sort of results per quarter.
Yeah.
And so you can't afford a hiccup of the tough quarter because everybody rotated. So we just don't do it.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Ed learned a long time ago at Ciba-Geigy, a Swiss chemical company, that they had somehow figured out a way to be able to do it. And I think isn't it the case that in Germany they with sort of boards and governance, they have a sort of a rotation system that's designed to do just this. It's to create this sort of cross-divisional empathy that is going to be beneficial, down the road.
Absolutely.
There's another thing that came up for me that I just want to talk about briefly, and that is that you were describing how it's really sort of a challenge to take time with our people, face to face, right? And I feel like one of the things that's happened in the last sort of 20 or 30 years of IT is that we've created these amazingly efficient systems to do everything, right? We've got, financial systems, we've got sales, lead management and SFA systems. We've got HR stacks that have, 15 different apps that you use. And so we've created a very rich set of systems that can easily fill our day. And what was in a way supposed to be systems that would make us more efficient at getting these things done quicker has actually given us more to fill our day with.
Yeah.
And it's again, the quote that I just can't get over right now is from a obscure T.S. Eliot poem where he said, that when we're facing challenges, we're dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. And so we've done that. We've created these perfect systems that automate our work lives amazingly. We've got Slack, we've got Workday, all of this stuff that makes all of our jobs so easy, except we spend all of our time on these systems that we're no longer being good with our people. That's I don't know if that's true, but that's something I would worry about.
Yeah. And I suppose in building on the way the conversation has been going for the last 5 or 10 minutes, this idea of defining communication and relationships as a key core part of the job. How do we do that? So if currently we're measuring things like output and productivity, how do we factor in that element of relationships and communication into how we define work?
We write about it and we give a lot of airtime and visibility to executives who do it, which will probably be more women than men. But the important point is to get the role model out there, that is in fact how some of the great leaders work. They work through building relationships rather than through making decisions.
Yeah.
We've got to get that out there.
I, for one, would gladly have Jacinda Ardern as our president. Just to name drop.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, do you have any examples? But she is a wonderful example, I think. She's a fantastic leader.
Maybe she's got a nice sandbox in New Zealand because it's just, it's an island nation and it's not very big. But, at the same time,
the same could be said for Ireland.
Scale. Yeah.
Yeah, could we scale up her role to somewhere like the United States? That would be, I wonder.
Probably not, because of our broken political system. The president's not as important in some respects, but there's still something to learn from. And the U.S. clearly wasn't ready for this. 4.5 years ago when we did not elect Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this idea of feminine values, we were I would say somewhat consciously careful not to say that in the Humble Leadership book, even though it was completely on our mind.
Yeah. But
I would say that Frederick Laloux and his Reinventing Organizations work had the courage to say that. Maybe we didn't want to get into a sort of a gender and sexual identity discussion that we're not qualified to have.
Okay.
But there's something there, and I'd love for more qualified people to either violently disagree with us and tell us why, or help us understand more what maybe we mean. Because it's one of those, it's something in the air, but it's a little hard to kind of pin down, and then of course it makes a lot of people very uncomfortable.
Exactly. This is it. Yeah. I mean, to me, it is a gender stereotype, but I think it's commonly accepted that it is kind of a feminine approach, feminine value that you're bringing in terms of relationship building. And without kind of veering completely away from the topic, like this idea of building relationships is and in another book that I read recently with Sally Helgeson and Marshall Goldsmith, where they talk about how women rise and how women get in their own way. And one of them is the fact that they're very good at building relationships, but they're not good at leveraging those relationships. And so that's something that is critical as well in order to kind of rise up through the ranks in an organization.
They may not be any better at running groups than men. I think the missing ingredient that I see all the time is nobody knows how to run a group.
Yeah, it comes
Our
back to this idea of
group
team
dynamics are totally missing everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that, you know, we see a lot or historically have seen a lot of in Silicon Valley, and I want to believe that some of the innovative, successful companies recognize this, is you take brilliant technical experts and then you promote them into management and leadership roles.
Yeah.
You know, that may not make sense.
Exactly. And again, this is something that has come up. I had an entire leadership series on the podcast previously as well. And this topic of manager versus leader, but also like if someone is really a really great technical expert, and especially in a sales arena, and they get promoted to be a leader of that team, then they're not really working to their strengths. And it's seen as this is the career path. This is how to earn more money, is by becoming a manager. When actually the person is much more comfortable doing the day-to-day job. They don't really want to be a leader, but it's seen as a wonderful career opportunity and more money and all of the other great things that go with it, you know, the recognition and all of that kind of stuff. So it's very tempting to accept that role as an individual. It's very tempting as an organization to promote someone who's really good at the job to being a leader of the team who carries out that job in the hopes of, and this again goes back to this idea of telling, in the hopes of imparting the knowledge and the wisdom that they have in how they do things, which may not necessarily translate to how the other employees carry out their best work.
Right.
One of the things another possibility for organizations, which many do, and that is that we are so individualistic in Western capitalism that what every group needs is a trained facilitator. I'm beginning to believe that what's expecting the CEO to build her own team, expecting a manager to know how to run groups, may be totally unrealistic. But I know lots of organizations who won't have a meeting without a trained facilitator being there who does know about groups and who is enormously helpful. And I have that experience all the time. The thing I bring most to organizations is not the one-on-one coaching, but sitting in a group and helping that group not to lose its way.
Yeah. I really, really like that. And really strangely and maybe serendipitously, that is something I've been thinking of recently, that because of the group dynamics that I'm dealing with, that it would be great to learn those facilitation skills or to hone the skills that I have and to become more of an expert in that area, because I think it's really, really crucially important. In the interest of time here, is there anything else that you'd like to say in terms of maybe the steps towards getting to Humble Enquiry? Like we've talked about the blockers, we've talked about some really, really interesting stuff around group dynamics and relationships and things like that. Anything else that you'd like to share from the book?
Can I just take a first stab at that? I don't know if we said this in the book explicitly, but I think it was implied that, one of the forms of inquiry that we're advocating is something we refer to as process inquiry, which is having the sort of mindfulness and the courage to sort of stop and say, how are we doing? Is this working? We let's say we have a 1 hour meeting with a packed agenda, and we just plow right into that agenda, and we end up hitting a bunch of log jams and disagreements and silent, the sort of silent objection, the loudest voice in the room, all the sort of classic 1 hour meeting dysfunctions. Do we have the license and the courage to say, wait a second, let's stop and just take a few minutes to talk about what's going on? Is this going well? Are we asking each other the right questions? Or are we just, arguing from our perches and not being willing to try to sort some of this out collectively? Asking those process inquiry questions. And to Ed's point about facilitation, it may be something that just the individual agents in that room do not have the detachment to say, all right, wait, I'm gonna pull out, I'm gonna step back and ask the group if how are we doing? We're so focused on our OKRs and our to-do lists and all of that to actually pull out and say, now I'm going to sort of take on a temporary facilitator role. That may be a lot to ask, but it has to be something to consider. And one way that we might suggest people do it, experiment with, is say, this is a 1 hour meeting that has to happen in 50 minutes because we're going to spend 10 minutes doing what we've referred to as a plus delta, where the plus is what worked and the delta is things we have to change. Okay. Whatever your framework is, are you going to allow yourself somewhere between 10 and 20% of the time to actually ask, how are we working together? How well are we doing? This is sort of a part of the reason we came up with this idea is that I was always very taken by this notion at Google, and I don't know if they still do this, but an engineer's role is to do their work for 4 days. And on the 5th day, go find somebody else, some other group, some other team that you need to go help. Go help another team for that 5th day. Do something that's productive for Google, but it's different than your day job. If we took that same idea and said, all right, 20% of the time is going to be on helping each other, not jamming through our agenda.
It goes back to this idea of being helpful versus being right as well, and not being afraid to leave your own ego and your own agenda at the door and come in with an open mind and say, how can this work better, and how can I be of better service, and how can I be more helpful to my colleagues, by challenging what's happening, if it is going around in circles, or if the group dynamic is not asking the right questions and things like that. Ed, do you have anything to add to that?
Just to reinforce the point that we've known forever that groups have a double agenda.
Okay.
They have a task to perform and they have to learn how to be a group. And we typically put all our energy into the task performance and give people no help or training in how to be a group.
Yeah. That's such a good point and very well made. So simple, and yet if we've known it for this long, why aren't we doing it?
Because the broader culture is so individualistic. We don't really value group work as a broader culture, and that's why we have no training and no programs. Do you have a program in Ireland on group dynamics? I bet you don't.
Not that I'm aware of. No.
Or it's one course at a business school that only 10% of the population takes.
Yeah, exactly. Or it's understanding different communication styles, but you're not really doing it as a team. You're doing it individualistically, so that I can understand how to communicate better with Peter, and Peter can understand how to communicate better with Ed, and and things like that. That it's not really done as a group, and maybe it is this idea of when the group initially forms, that the core area that you need to focus on is how are we going to work as a team, and what does that look like, and do we create a team charter, for example, and what needs to be on that, and how do we agree when there's conflict in the team, how does it get resolved, and all of those great questions that probably people don't think about. They just get on with it, or they have a moan to someone else behind their back, or something like that, which doesn't serve the overall purpose of the team either.
Right. Yeah, they take a vote and then they create, one side versus another side.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, rather than
voting,
giving
it's
accountability.
It's great.
Yeah. Well, just give accountability to people and say, this is your ultimate responsibility. You make the decision. You're welcome to get input from other people, so it feels like they've been involved and it's an informed decision. But ultimately, it's your area of yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's still a tell.
Yeah. Anything else then to share just before we kind of close up, round up the podcast?
No, I'm very happy that we've covered a lot of ground.
We have certainly covered a lot of ground, and I've so enjoyed the conversation. There is one question that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, and that is, what makes you happier at work?
Well, I mean, so for Ed and I think what makes us happiest is when we sort of stimulate each other. But this is an unusual situation. We've known each other for a very, very long time. And if we don't have a depth of relationship, like generally fathers and sons do, and some father and son relationships are better than others. Ed's and mine is very good and very healthy.
Yeah.
But there is something to that idea of it's in the off moments that you stimulate each other with a kind of a different idea, or that's why I think one of the things that's happened in the pandemic, with everybody sort of screening into each other rather than actually bumping into each other in the hall, is have we been able to do that? Have we been able to sort of find those extra layers, those extra ideas that come out of contemporaneous human relationship?
Yeah.
We know that happens when we're bumping into somebody at, in the kitchen or in the hall at work. I hope that we're figured out ways over Zoom and whatever your video system is to have the time to do that as well. I fear that what's happened is that Zoom has just made us even more agenda bound. So we'll see. I don't know what's happening in Ireland. There's lots of talk about the next quarter or two, companies are going to start bringing people back to work, because there is that sense that you need to create those moments for people to stimulate each other. In ways that don't have to do with the job. They don't have to do with the social element. They have to do with clarity.
The social element of it. And I think, so we're talking, I think, at this stage, September, when people will start going back to offices, but it won't be full. It'll be a hybrid type of approach. And I mean,
which might be very good. That might actually be sort of a real step forward for all of us.
Definitely. And if people want to reach out, if they want to get in touch, if they want to find out where the book is available, now's the opportunity to tell them.
Well, it's certainly available on the sort of all of the conventional physical book and ebook platforms. And then our site, OCLI.org, Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute, OCLI.org, just has a little bit more about us and some of our other books and other things that we're thinking about and working on.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Likewise. Great conversation. Great questions. Moving the ball forward.
This is it.